Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight at a presidential library where I've done very useful research on 3 of the books I wrote about Ronald Reagan. The first 2 were written before the library was built. And I want to say, before I start, I want to thank Jerry Conlon. Jerry, you are the most persistent person I think I've ever met. I'm getting on in life, as are a lot of us. I'm trying to cut back on my speeches and stuff for health reasons, and I finally concluded that the only way that I was going to get rid of Jerry Conlon calling me was to say yes. So I did, and I'm here, and I'm happy to be here because I really think a lot of all of you. How many of you were docents in 2006? Oh my. So, okay. So some of you are probably going to recognize part of this speech because that's the last time I spoke to the docents. But US Grant is reported to have said once that he knew 2 tunes. One of them was Yankee Doodle and the other wasn't. And so I guess this is as close as you'll get to Yankee Doodle. With me tonight, as Jerry mentioned, is my wife, Mary, who is, in addition to accompanying me here and making me feel better, as she always does when she's with me, she is the researcher for President Reagan, the role of a lifetime. She reads everything I write and indexes my considerable archives on Reagan and on other issues. And I thank you, Mary, as always. I will leave time for questions after my presentation. Presidential biographers are somewhat on a dual track. They have to relate the story of their subject's presidency, but their other track is they have to tell the readers how the subject reached the highest office in the land. And in my view, it is following the second track that biographers most often go awry. There are 2 customary pitfalls. One is to embellish a president's early life as a means of establishing his good character. Parson Weems, the author of an early worshipful biography of George Washington, set the standard for this by relating a series of fables about General Washington, as if the truth wasn't sufficient. Parson Weems embellished it, and you know many of the stories, the best known of which is the invention that Washington confessed to chopping down a cherry tree because he could not tell a lie, which was entirely the product of Mr. Weems' imagination. There are hundreds and hundreds of such biographies, unfortunately, of presidents, commonly called hagiographies, and there are some of those of Reagan, too. I guess my favorite invented story was by the biographer of US Grant, who wrote that the hard-drinking general and later president drank nothing stronger than ice water. The second harmful tendency for biographers is to see that everything that happened in a president's past is inevitably led him to the White House. As a British historian put it, history is written backwards. We know what's happened, but we don't know what happened at the time. It's lived forwards. Reagan followed a long trail with many detours, and I don't think all of them led to the White House. Indeed, in 1951, when Reagan played opposite the title chimpanzee in the movie Bedtime for Bonzo, which I'm unfortunately old enough to have seen it when it came out, it would have seemed inconceivable to any of us who saw that charming comedy to think that Reagan would one day, as President of the United States, be sitting down with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to negotiate the end of the Cold War. In all probability, it would have been inconceivable to Reagan, too. He was at the time a Democrat on the fringes of politics, and he didn't really think of advancing himself, but of making a difference. Reagan was always, Democrat and Republican, more interested in our country than he was in himself. For the first 50-some years of his life, he was not involved in the pursuit of any political office. He was a striver, to be sure, blessed with a smart and spiritual mother and overcoming the burden of an alcoholic father, Reagan grew up during the Great Depression and had several careers before politics: sports announcer, movie actor, television host, businessman, labor leader. He was a superior swimmer, an excellent writer, and good with his hands. These were important achievements. When he entered the world of politics, Ronald Reagan was an accomplished person who had already done something in his life, and many things. I've deliberately sort of backed into discussing those aspects of Ronald Reagan that were crucial to his presidency, because I think if Ronald Reagan had never become president, if he'd never gone into politics, this library wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be here in this setting, but he'd be a very interesting person, and he would have been a good person to know, as people who had the privilege of knowing him, including me, felt. Reagan, the political leader, he didn't spring upon the national stage like Athena from the bow of Zeus, even though it might have seemed this way to people who heard his stirring speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964. Reagan was, as we all are, the product of his time and his personal history. And I think it's important to the way he went about things as governor and president that he had never been dependent upon politics for a job or an income. He was a success outside the world of politics, which imbued in him, I think, the confidence he would need in dark and difficult moments of his presidency. Reagan was proud of having been an actor. Indeed, he joked late in his presidency that he didn't see how anybody could do the job without having been an actor. Running for governor of California in 1966, his first campaign, which I covered, Reagan accepted most criticisms of his policies with equanimity, but he bridled at any suggestion that he was a second-rate actor. Indeed, he was a competent actor, most often playing in movies, as Gary Wills wrote, the heartwarming role of himself. Reagan had many qualities that benefited him as president. Excuse me. Most famously, his optimism and his self-assurance. Americans want confident leaders, but they do not like leaders who are puffed up. And Reagan's humility was expressed in many ways, but especially, I think, in his self-deprecating sense of humor. He understood, as well as anyone I have ever known, in or out of politics, the distinction between seriousness of purpose and taking oneself too seriously. He poked fun at his age, his work habits, his movies, his ideology, his vanities, his memory lapses, and the suspicion that he was unintelligent. A wire service reporter got hold of a studio picture of Bedtime for Bonzo showing Reagan with the chimpanzee. He asked Reagan to sign it, and Reagan complied, writing above the signature, "I'm the one with the watch." At a gridiron dinner, President Reagan joked, "I know that nobody ever died of hard work, but I figure, why take the chance?" When Reagan's amiable press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, fell asleep on Air Force One, someone took a picture and gave it to Reagan, who signed it to Fitzwater with the inscription, "Marlin, we're only supposed to do this at cabinet meetings." Reagan wrote most of his one-liners. He wrote most of his speeches, too, before he was governor, and many of them after he was governor. He understood the purpose of humor in a speech, which is to establish a bond with the audience. At times, to be sure, Reagan's sense of humor got the best of him. Asked in 1965 what kind of a governor he would be, Reagan said, "I don't know, I've never played a governor." Now, his trusted aide, Lynn Knopfsinger, who helped him in those days, and Lynn could also be quite funny, he didn't like the implications of the answer because he was sort of implying the governorship was just another movie. And of course, there was the time, which many of you will remember in his presidency, when Reagan joked during a warm-up for a radio broadcast that the bombing of Russia begins in 5 minutes. Reagan had used gallows humor for years in warm-ups to keep everybody relaxed. The remarks were supposed to be off the record and were, except for this one occasion. Still, Reagan reluctantly agreed with his critics that he shouldn't have said it. Reagan's gift, not unique, but certainly rare, is that he almost never let his ego get in the way of what he was trying to accomplish. When he was president-elect and met with Tip O'Neill, then Speaker of the House, he didn't care that Tip put him down by saying that California was the minor leagues and that Washington was the big leagues. Tip as he liked to do, was testing the new guy in town. And Reagan's aides were furious at what they saw as disrespect. But Reagan told me afterward that he thought there was an advantage to being underestimated by the Speaker of the House. Now, many of you will know that Tip and Reagan, who rarely agreed on anything, became very good friends. And the only thing that Tip ever wanted to be besides Speaker of the House was Ambassador to Ireland, and that was offered to him by Reagan, but unfortunately Tip's wife was too ill for him to accept it. Reagan was underrated. Much of his career, he was underrated first by, and perhaps understandably, by Governor Pat Brown, who was seeking a third term, and he was vulnerable after 2 terms. And Brown believed what I think was the conventional wisdom that Reagan, as an actor, just running for the governorship, didn't have much chance. And he believed that, Pat believed that Reagan was probably the only Republican he could beat. As it turned out, Reagan won by nearly 1 million votes. Subsequently, President Carter underestimated Reagan. After George H.W. Bush upset Reagan in the Iowa caucuses in 1980, a Carter aide lamented to me that Bush would be the nominee, and he was very unhappy about this because he said that Reagan would be much easier to beat than Bush. There are, in the words of the old saying, more tears caused by answered prayers than by unanswered ones. After his defeat in Iowa, Reagan rose to the occasion in New Hampshire in a memorable confrontation with Bush. I can still remember this like it happened yesterday. I had like a third-row seat, in which Reagan declared in a paraphrased line from a Spencer Tracy movie, "I paid for this microphone." He defeated Bush, and that fall in the debate with President Carter, Mr. Reagan won the day with another one-liner, "There you go again." A lot of people remember the line. What they don't know, I wrote it, but it's not something that people think about. The line was not an accident. Reagan had used it in a rehearsal in which it was David Stockman was playing the role, I think, of Carter, and they were going over what Reagan should have said, and some of Reagan's advisors were giving him a very long-winded answer, and Reagan said, "What I should have said is, 'There you go again.'" And he got the chance and did. After Reagan became president, he was underestimated by the Democrats, by the Washington and academic establishments, by much of the media, and until Gorbachev came along, by the leaders of the Soviet Union. Howell Raines of the New York Times was at the time a White House correspondent. He wrote many years later in my paper, the Washington Post, "My generation of White House correspondents was accused of covering up Ronald Reagan's supposed stupidity and his reliance on fictional facts derived from Errol Flynn movies and the John Birch Society." In 1981, Clark Clifford, the Democratic wise man, entertained Georgetown dinner parties with the killer line that Reagan was an amiable dunce. 20 years later, we know that Clark Clifford was charged in a banking scandal, and the dunce ended the Cold War. Reagan wrote this as a jumping-off point for a useful discussion on the importance of intelligence in the presidency. As readers of President Reagan, the role of a lifetime, know, I deal with this issue in some detail, relying heavily on Professor Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Reagan had a high level of what Gardner called interpersonal intelligence. I'm going to skip that discussion tonight in the interest of time, but I do want to talk about the matter of temperament, which is crucial, in my view, to the presidency. If we were to rank presidents of the 20th century on a commonly accepted scale of intelligence quotient, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover, and Carter would be very high on the list. They were not, on balance, successful presidents, although I am a kind of a contrarian defender of Wilson. Many people would give a low IQ rank to Harry Truman or to Reagan, and they were eminently successful presidents. And there's another successful president with a happy temperament who, when he took office, was not seen as particularly bright at all. His best biographer wrote of him, "He was his own least reliable witness, unable or unwilling to tell the truth about his early years. Few leaders in our history can have labored harder to create a personal past less rooted in reality. There's always both more and less to him than meets the eye." The biographer here is the masterful Jeffrey Ward, writing about Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Reagan's first political icon. Ward wrote a lovely book called First Class Temperament, The Emergence of Franklin Roosevelt, which was, the title was taken from a famous judgment passed by Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom FDR visited in his Georgetown home on March 8, 1933, which was Holmes' 91st birthday. FDR had just been installed as president. Holmes had a year earlier retired from the Supreme Court, to which he was appointed by Franklin's cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. FDR and Holmes chatted. FDR asked about a sword over the mantel. Holmes said his grandfather had used it in the French and Indian War. FDR told him that his grandmother went back to the Revolutionary War. That wasn't true. Ward observed, as Ward observed, FDR's grandmothers had been born after the Revolution. After FDR left, a friend who had sat through the meeting asked Holmes his opinion of the new president. A second-rate intellect, Holmes said, but a first-class temperament. It wasn't necessarily meant as a compliment. Reagan also had a first-class temperament. With this temperament came courage, deep convictions, and common sense. A debate began within the ranks of Reagan's own staff while he was president that lingers to this day. It's, to boiling it down, it has a lot of different legs to it and nuances, but the essence of it is, did Reagan succeed as president because of his conservatism or despite it? I think the answer to that is both. Reagan lowered taxes, too much as it turned out, and he also raised them several times. The bottom line, however, is that the marginal income tax rate, the rate at which your last dollar of income is taxed, was 70% when he took office and 28% when he left. He built up the nation's military strength, and as he promised, used the buildup, as a basis for negotiating with the Soviet Union. He restored the confidence of Americans in themselves, which Reagan considered his most important achievement. He could not have done these things without his conservative convictions, or without his talent for practical politics and compromising as well. Each year for President's Day, the Gallup polling organization asks Americans whom they believe to be their greatest president. This year, Ronald Reagan won handily, with Abraham Lincoln second, followed by Bill Clinton, John Kennedy, George Washington, and Franklin Roosevelt. Now, public opinion isn't to be scoffed at, but one doesn't have to go as far as the Gallup respondents to realize that Reagan was a transformational president. To say that is not to exempt him from criticism. Much is expected of our presidents, and all of them have flaws. Theodore Roosevelt, who is highly rated by many historians, signed a secret treaty that gave Japan a free hand to take over Korea. Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom most historians rank as the greatest president of the 20th century, needlessly interned some 110,000 Japanese Americans during World War II and caused them to lose most of their property and possessions. Readers of my books, which I'm sure include many of you, know that I'm critical of Reagan policies in Central America and a muddled deployment to Lebanon, among other things. But the great transformational presidents are remembered for their leadership in times of crisis. As the historian Doug Brinkley Riley put it, speaking to that same forum which Tom Brokaw chaired, and Brinkley was offering a kind of a low-key defense of Reagan, and he said, no one remembers if Abraham Lincoln balanced the budget. What we remember about Lincoln is that he preserved the Union and freed the slaves. What we think of Washington, it is not the myths circulated by Parson Weems that stand out, but Washington's great leadership and signal contribution to the birth of our country, and also refusing to seek another term as president because he wanted us to have an orderly succession in our republic. We remember FDR for his leadership during the Depression and World War II. And Reagan will be remembered for many things, but I think he will be remembered most because with Gorbachev, he ended the Cold War, which benefited mankind as well as the United States, and which it certainly did. Conservatives tend to give more credit to Reagan and liberals do to Gorbachev, but this is not quite as symmetrical as that sentence makes it sound. I've examined numerous transcripts on conferences about the end of the Cold War, and I've read many books by the participants, and it's interesting to me that the Soviet leaders, beginning with Gorbachev, are far less reluctant than most American liberals to give Reagan the credit he deserves. And it's not just for the end of the Cold War, it's for the fact that the Cold War ended peacefully. Both Reagan and Gorbachev knew of instances in which the United States and the Soviet Union, with thousands of nuclear missiles that were on hair trigger alert and aimed at each other's countries, had almost blundered into war. In a 1983 incident, a Soviet satellite picked up signs of what seemed to be a US nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. The Soviet colonel in charge didn't believe what the technology was telling him and acted on his own power to prevent a nuclear war. But it was a near-run thing. Although they put it in somewhat different ways, both Gorbachev and Reagan rejected the doctrine that they had inherited of mutual assured destruction, which Reagan called a truly mad policy. It was a policy we'd long relied on, but which Reagan discarded because he believed it was both immoral and dangerous. Alexander Bezsmertnik, the deputy Soviet foreign minister at the time, praised Reagan and Gorbachev for their convictions. They were not just men who could trim their sails and go the way the wind blows, he said. This is what they sensed in each other, and it's why they made good partners. Reagan handled negotiations very well, Bezsmertnik said. He might not have known all the details. He used little cards when he would come to details. He didn't like the formal part of negotiations. He would try to rush through the formal part, and then he would throw away the cards and start talking his direct way. I was across the table at all the summits, and I personally admired this man very much. He was a good politician, he was a good diplomat, he was very dedicated, and if it were not for Reagan, I don't think we would have been able to reach the agreements in arms control that we reached later because of his idealism, because he thought that we should really do away with nuclear weapons. Gorbachev believed in that. Reagan believed in that. The experts didn't believe, but the leaders did. To this account, I think it should be added, contrary to what I have often seen written, that Reagan always intended to negotiate with the Soviets. He came into office doing that, but it hadn't been possible until Gorbachev came along. When Reagan entered the White House, he was convinced from his own reading that the Central Intelligence Agency estimates of Soviet prowess were exaggerated, and that the Soviet Union was too destitute economically to compete with the US military buildup. Before he was nominated, he said in a meeting with editors and reporters at the Washington Post that a renewed arms race would bring the Soviet Union to the bargaining table. Reagan felt that this bargaining would be successful only if we negotiated with the Soviets from a position of strength. But what made him different from many of his fellow conservatives, and different too, I think, from liberals who looked upon the Cold War as sort of an eternal condition, was he saw strength as a means toward an end of negotiations that would eliminate or at a minimum greatly reduce the Soviet threat. Soon after Reagan's first meeting with Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985, I asked him, "What's the most neglected aspect of your biography, Mr. President?" "Negotiating for the Screen Actors Guild," he replied. What did he learn in those negotiations, I wanted to know? That the purpose of a negotiation is to get an agreement, Reagan replied. And so it turned out that this most conservative and anti-communist of all presidents sat down with Gorbachev, and after many ups and downs, on December 8, 1987, signed the first treaty of the Cold War that reduced nuclear arsenals instead of stabilizing them at a higher level. This agreement was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty. And it's worth remembering that a lot of conservatives didn't like it. Reagan's ideological mentor, William F. Buckley, a great man, came to the White House to ask Reagan not to sign the treaty he had negotiated. The columnist George Will called it moral disarmament. Henry Kissinger, who retrospectively praises Reagan, said when it mattered that he had grave reservations about the INF Treaty. But Reagan took his case to the people, and the Senate ratified the treaty. It was a precursor to other treaties, including the one most recently signed by President Obama, which made deeper reductions in nuclear arsenals. Today, US and Russian specialists inspect nuclear weapons on each other's soil, an action that would have been seen as unbelievably utopian when Reagan became president. There are many other aspects to Reagan's legacy. I've examined them in my books. They're on display here in the library. You know about them and talk to people about them. I want to close not with an overarching point, but with a memory of Reagan, who was an enjoyable person to be around, and whom I felt most privileged to have covered as a journalist and to have written about in my books. What I'm about to relate happened when Reagan was governor. He made a speech at a Yosemite National Park lodge with a magnificent edifice of El Capitan. For those of you who've been there, I'm sure you remember it, towers 3,000 feet over Yosemite Valley. Reagan and his aides walked out of the lodge. Looking up at El Capitan, Reagan said, "See that face in the mountain?" One by one, his aides saw that face in the mountain. They described various features, one the nose, one the eyebrows, until one aide said, "I'm sorry, Governor, but I don't see any face in that mountain." "I don't either," Reagan said. "I just want to see what each of you would say." Now, I didn't hear that story until many years later. And when I asked Reagan about it, he laughed and said, "I just wanted to find out who the yes men were." And on that note, I think I'll close and take your questions.